All right, folks, so it's 12 o'clock and we're going to start the meeting. Anybody entering the meeting now, please make sure if you have want DEC credits to click on the chat box at the bottom of the chat box where it says type message here. Type in your full name and your certification number, and we're going to do that at the end of the meeting again. And CCA folks, the Certified Crop Advisors, we're going to show you a slide at the very end of the meeting, and you'll be able to use your app if you have it on your phone to scan that NCR code. And if not, you can take a picture of it and you can enter the information on the website later. Thank you all for coming today. I hope you get a lot out of this. We have a great speaker today. We're going to start off with a poll. If you've never seen one of these before, I'm going to launch it, and you're going to basically, for each one of those questions, identify by clicking on the circle that best answers the question for you. And then we'll move on with today's program. So you should see two questions in front of you and some potential answers. Please click on that circle that best fits you. We'll give you a little bit of time to put your answers in. All right, I want to thank you all for participating in that. We're going to share the results real quick. And just to show that, grasses are probably harder to identify than broadleaf weeds, and there are plenty of people that can identify a few, and most of us need a little bit of help. And that's the reason why Carrie's with us today. I'm going to stop sharing this. And we can move on with our presentation. I'd like to introduce Caroline Marschner. She's an extension associate with a focus on weed ecology and invasive species. She works with the De Tomaso lab on weed ecology and identification. Great to have you here today, Caroline, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your day to hang out and learn about grasses with us. This is part of a much larger series, and we've already done broadleaf weeds a couple weeks ago. Coming up are some really great talks that are focused on commodity-specific weed management. And Lynn has a lot of really great information on alternative weed management and new weed technologies that are coming down the line. Because we have these upcoming talks that are really commodity specific, I did put a lot of crop specific control information into my slides, and you can take a look at that. And we're recording this, you'll be able to go back and look at it again if you want, but I'm not going to dwell on that stuff too much because the real experts are coming in the next few weeks. So why do you want to identify grasses? You walk up to your field and it's looking like this. And if you already have a weed management protocol in place, do you really need to know what grass that is? If you're using a pre-program, it really helps to know what you've got there, because the different chemicals that you might choose for an herbicide application are going to have really different effects on these different grasses that we see pretty commonly. And so it's good to know if what you've got is something like Foxtail or Quackgrass, which is an annual that's pretty well controlled by a lot of different stuff. Or if you're looking at one of these hard to manage perennials, or you've got some kind of volunteer in your field. So it's worth knowing what you're treating. And also the individual species have pretty specific management. If you're looking at post-application, it's as long as you can use Roundup, you're doing pretty good unless you have yellow nutsedge. But if you've been forced to look outside of your glyphosate because of other herbicide resistances, then you're back in that area where you really need to know what you've got to select an effective control. So identification, we've all been out looking at plants and learning to identify them. And so you look at leaf shape, right? Not so useful with grasses. No, you look at how the leaves are arranged. Also not so useful for grasses. Flowers, unless you're an expert, they really all kind of look the same to us. And there a lot of hardcore grass ID does have to do with the flowering structures. But I'm not going to talk about that at all today because that's not useful when you're out in your farm field trying to figure out what you got. This is what you look at when you're looking at a grass. One of the first places to start if you're not out trying to figure it out in the spring when your grasses are super small. So if you're planning ahead for next year's treatments, you can look at the previous year and say, what is this grass that seems to be getting out of hand in my field? The root structure is going to be really informative. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another really useful, you can look at the flowers because the flowers do look different on our different grasses. You just have to hit them at the right time. The leaves do have structures to look at, but they're different from what we look at in broadleaves. And this collar region is really critical for grass identification. Let me show you why. In the collar region, we have a couple of really specialized structures that are the way that you identify grasses. And one of the easiest ones is the ligul. The ligul is this little structure that's right where the leaf blade joins the stem. And it can be nothing at all, in which case you're looking at Barnard grass. Or it can be membranous, like this papery ligul that you see right here. This is orchard grass. Or it can be fringed, like a fringe of hairs, right there at the collar. And this is really this trait, once you get used to looking for it, this really helps you figure out what you can be looking at, because the different groups of grasses have one or the other or none. And that really helps narrow down what you could be looking at. Another thing that is in this collar region is auricles. This part of your ear, the dangly bit of your ear, is also called an auricle, but this is an auricle on a grass. And the easiest ones to see and the ones that are really diagnostic are these clasping claw-like projections that reach around the stem. Quackgrass is these, and that's a really good way to identify quackgrass. They can also be shorter and a little less obvious. Tall fescue has a little auricle here. And so the shape of that auricle is important. A lot of our grasses don't have an auricle. See how this leaf blade just goes straight into the sheath here. There's no additional projection. So most of our grasses don't have auricles. So ligules and auricles. Another thing that we spend a lot of time thinking about with grasses is it hairy or not? And this can be the stem, but a lot of times we're looking at the leaves. Foxtails are a great example of this. So we've got 3 or maybe 4 because somebody submitted a new and different foxtail to me in the registrations, but these are the common 3. And the way you tell them apart is really by looking at the hairs on the leaf blades. Green foxtail, you can see it's got a hairy ligule, but no leaves on the blade. Yellow foxtail has these really interesting, wispy, floppy hairs that are mostly down here near the collar at the base of the blade. And giant foxtail, which is actually our most problematic of our foxtails, is covered in peach fuzz on the top of the leaf. So if you take the leaf and you sort of bend it away from you and look over the top of the leaf blade, it's easy to see this peach fuzz on the giant foxtail. So that's a great way to tell the foxtails apart and a good demonstration of why you might want to look at leaf hairs. What kind of roots, what do the roots tell us? So a lot of our grasses are regular annual grasses, and most of those just have a normal root system like this. They just have regular roots coming down. If you pull up your grass and it looks like this, you've got probably an annual grass. If you pull it up and you see something like this, these nodules underground, like tubers or corms, you're looking at a perennial. And in our state, you're probably looking at yellow nutsedge. And then these, you can actually see these rhizomes both in this picture, these thick, fleshy, often pointed, they're like extra big roots. These are what a lot of perennial grasses use to spread. You can see them over here too on the yellow nutsedge. So if you see that kind of bigger root structure, you're probably looking at a perennial grass and not an annual. That's a great way to narrow down what you might be looking at. One of the harder things, I think, but really useful, is the new leaves as they're forming. They're coming out of the top of the grass. They grow in different organizational ways. They can be triangular. Actually, they can't be. I'll tell you why. They can be rolled up like a fruit roll up, or they can be folded. Our orchard grasses are folded. A lot of the stems on the folded species, and we have less of those than we do the rolled ones. The stems tend to be flattened or compressed, so they look more like an oval and less like a circle. Orchard grass is one of those, and our bluegrasses are also like that. A lot of ours are rolled. And then if you see a triangular cross section like this, it's a sedge, and not a grass actually, but looks a lot like a grass. And if it's in your farm field, it's probably yellow nutsedge. So I'm going to walk through, now that we've kind of talked about what you can look at, I'm going to walk through some management resources that you can look at once you identify your grass and see, what do I do about this specific grass? And then I'm going to go through some of our more common grasses and talk about how you can identify them and what their, just like Brian did a couple weeks ago, what their Achilles heel might be, if I could find one for that species. Some of you might have known Chuck Muller. He worked in our lab with Tony DiTomaso, and I'm sorry to say that he passed away last year, but his book has finally been published. He worked on this for over a decade, and it is a real wealth of information on how you can manage your weeds on your farm if you are either seeking to obtain or to maintain an organic certification, or if you're struggling with herbicide resistance and you're trying to look outside of chemical management. All of the stuff in here is what you can do for non-chemical management and what you could layer on top of chemical management in terms of cultural or physical management. So he was really an expert on cultivation tools. He has a whole chapter devoted to different kinds of tine weeders, different kinds of sweeps, different kinds of rotary hoes, and all that stuff. He also talks a lot about rotation and timing and row crop spacing, that kind of thing. It's all in there. And a lot of what's on my slides came from his book because He also, at the end, has chapters for 63 different species that are common and problem weeds in the US, and a lot of them we have here. Hopefully you guys all know about this resource. This is CCE's Integrated Field Crop Management Guides. They haven't put out the 2022 one yet, but everybody you know from CCE who does field crops has some input into this, and it's a great resource. The nice thing about this is that all of the stuff in this is New York specific. So if you're looking at some of the also good resources that are from out of state, some of their suggestions might not be applicable in New York because some of the chemicals aren't certified for use in New York. This also covers not just weed management, but also insect pests and pathogens and planting recommendations, and harvest recommendations, all of that stuff. It's sort of a one-stop shop for great advice for field crops in New York. Another really good resource that Brian showed me and that I used a lot in developing these is the MidAtlantic Weed Control Guide. This is out of Penn State Extension. John Wallace, who just joined them from Cornell a few years ago, was involved in this 2022 update. This is all herbicide tables, and it's very comprehensive and easy to interact with. And it covers corn and soy, small grains, and legume forages, and also sorghum. We have a website, the Cornell Weed ID website, where I think you can find a lot of the information on ID if I don't cover it here today, or if you need a refresher. So we have different groups of weeds for the different commodity groups. And there's a field crops section and a pasture section, but we also have a just weed species list. You can scroll down and pick the species that you're trying to figure out. And one of the most useful things in the grasses section of this is that there are these tables that help answer the kind of question that Carol has about how do I distinguish between two different species at different life stages. And so on each of the species profiles, it'll have a table like this where you're looking at Italian ryegrass, here are the other similar species and what's the same and what's different between the species. I think this might be a really useful resource. Are there any questions on management resources? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the species profiles, starting with the small grains and forages. Two of these are actually bluegrasses. And this is a good example of why you might want to be able to identify the species, because one of them is annual and the other one's not. So annual bluegrass, this bluegrass is generally a really good way to identify a bluegrass is to look at the leaf tips. They're the only genus that has these sort of front of a canoe shaped keeled leaf tip. They're really, really easy to see. And that's a great way to say, okay, this is a bluegrass. And then it gets harder when you get to which bluegrass. This bluegrass, annual bluegrass, does show up in our fields, but it's also a turf grass, so it's everywhere. But it's short. It's less than a foot usually. And the flowering heads that you can see up in the upper left-hand corner don't go very much above that foliage. Even the seedlings, as soon as they come up, you can see this prow-shaped keeled leaf tip. And so that's a good way, if you're out in the spring and you're looking, or in the fall, you can see that right away. And here's that membranous ligule and no hairs on the leaf blade. This one has some resistance, not in New York, but in other places in New York. Sorry, other places in the US. So it might be a good idea if you've been treating for a couple of years in your field and you're seeing this continue to spread and you feel like you've gotten your timing right and everything's been good with your management and it's just not controlling this weed, let somebody at Cornell know, us or Lynn or the new hire who's going to be doing field crops, and we'll work with you to figure out if you are seeing herbicide resistance here. These reroot really easily, seedlings, so it's better to bury them than to stir the soil and uproot them because they'll just reroot. And so the Achilles heel for these guys is burial and disturbance in the spring and the fall. Group 15 herbicides work pretty well for this. This is the perennial bluegrass, and I actually didn't find a lot of resources for this, for control or even ID. But what I did find was 2 different articles, one from Pennsylvania and one from Ohio from last summer and fall that said, this is an increasing problem in our small grains and forage in those adjoining states for us. So I think that this is becoming more of an issue. And so keep an eye out for it. It hasn't developed a lot of resistances yet. The only one I found was in France. Look for this in April. The easiest way to tell this from the annual bluegrass is that it's 3 feet tall. So it can actually overtop your small grain. So if you're seeing something that has that keeled tip and membranous ligule, folded structure, folded leaves, and it's overtopping your crop, it's probably rough stock bluegrass. And it's not the same groups that are useful for this. The group 2s and the group 9s are better for this species. Jeff, did you have a question?
There was one question from Carol Holtz, and it was distinguishing factors that might be present to identify downy brome versus Japanese brome by the 3-leaf stage.
I don't have an answer for that.
And that's fine. We can look that up and see if we can come up with an answer.
Yeah, I will try to come up with one, and we can include it in the follow-up email.
Thank you.
Another problem weed for these crops are the rye grasses. And the rye grasses are kind of complicated because we have 2 different species that are called annual ryegrass. And so there are management tables for annual ryegrass. That's for one of these. And we have reports that we need control information for annual ryegrass that we got in our registrations, but I don't know which species you're talking about. So one of them could be the Italian/annual rye, which is the multiflorum species. That one's a crop that sometimes we have an issue with volunteers or with termination. And then the other one is rigid ryegrass, which is actually a weed. And they look pretty similar. And the way to tell them apart is to look at the seeds, the flowering heads. The weedy one doesn't have as many, you see it doesn't have as many flowers in each of these packets of flowers. And they're held a little more tightly to the stem. These are winter cool season grasses, so management in summer can be really effective, and their seeds don't live very long. They're super abundant, but they're short-lived. So if you're having problems with these species in a field, rotating in a summer row crop can help because it interrupts the life cycle and the seed production. When you're harvesting small grains, these guys actually, the seeds mature a little later than the small grains. So if you collect the chaff when you're harvesting, then you're getting most, not all, but most of the seed. So that can be a good option. And Lynn's going to talk about windrow burning at the end of this series. There were several good herbicides for these. I'm going to shift over to no-till just a few species for no-till corn and soy. One of the most problematic of which is quackgrass. We had that one come up a lot in our registration. This one has those clawed clasping auricles that makes it pretty easy to identify. And if you have an aggressive perennial with these really intense roots and those clasping auricles, you're probably looking at quackgrass. It has these very narrow flowering heads that also helps. This doesn't really have an Achilles heel. It's a really powerful weed. It responds really well to nitrogen. I mean, it loves lots of nitrogen. I guess that's not responding well from our perspective. So if you have this weed in your farm fields, it's probably a good idea to think about the Adapt-N program, or in some other way, really focus your fertilization so that it's exactly as much as you need for your crop, and it's right where you need it, so that you're not feeding this grass, because it does much better when it has lots of nitrogen. This is not, a lot of the annuals you can rotate into alfalfa or hay to knock them back, and that doesn't work for this one because it's very happy in that system. Repeated tillage, if you do tillage, can work. Repeated mowing after harvest can help. And undersown cover crops can help if you're set up for that. And the herbicides, there were just a few classes you can see there that are good for this species. Wire stem muley is another one that's in the state. It's another pretty aggressive perennial. Again, if you pull it up and look at the roots, you'll see these really thick, fleshy rhizomes. These are shorter and they have kind of scales on them that you can see there. That might help with the identification of this. It also has a really short leaf blades. This is one of our weeds where the leaf blades are actually helpful because they're shorter than the rest of our grasses. And as they spread out like this, you'll see wiry stems heading for the ground, which is why it's called wire stem muley. So that's another good identification. A lot of the recommendations that I saw for this were just sort of hygiene, making sure you have weed-free seed, make sure you clean if you have this in one of your farm fields, make sure you clean your equipment before you move on so that you don't drag rhizomes into your next field. This one is fairly late to emerge in the spring. So something that you plant early and narrow that will have canopy closure quickly can help with this. And then the rotation into the alfalfa or hay is useful for this one. And for this, herbicide treatments in the midsummer is most effective. And in alfalfa, really the only one that worked reasonably well was Select. When I use the trade names, it's not because I'm pushing that particular product. It's just the chemical class that's in is what I'm suggesting. Johnson grass is a new and growing problem in our state. This is the weed that Tony DiTomaso has been talking about as long as I've known him, because he's been worried about it coming into New York, and it has come into New York, and it is starting to behave aggressively in our state. We have a grad student who's working on this weed, and he thinks he's going to have to take his plots out early because his Johnson grass is spreading so fast. It's a really aggressive weed. It's one of the 10 worst global weeds. It's especially bad in no-till systems. And it has developed herbicide resistance. Other places in the US, we have not verified any of them in New York yet, but check out those group numbers. And if you have Johnson grass and it's not responding to these, please let Lynn know, or the new hire when we get him. And we can, again, work with you to try to do some resistance testing. Yeah. the only Achilles heel that I found in the resources for this was that the rhizomes are sensitive to extreme heat and cold. So if you can expose them during an extreme weather, that can work. But if you're doing no-till, you're probably not doing that. There are a bunch of options in here that you can read through, mostly having to do with rotation. And then in corn and soy, the pre-herbicide treatments didn't work that well for this. It might emerge late enough that they're not controlling it very well. Several of the post ones, though, worked really well for this weed. There were only a couple of options that were effective in sorghum if you're planting that. So again, this one, you're looking for the rhizome, and it has a membranous ligule that you can kind of see there. And then one of the diagnostic things for this weed species is the white stripe on the top, along the midrib on the top of the leaf. And it has these tall open panicles, big, often reddish or purplish flowering heads. Foxtails, we already talked about these some, but these are super common in our field crops. They're when we do our weed seedling emergence counts, these are always our most abundant weed seedling at Musgrave and often at Freeville. And we already talked about this. The giant foxtail is the one that has this peach fuzz on it, and then the yellow foxtail with the wispy hairs, and the no leaf blade hairs for the green foxtail, but also the heads are subtly different. The green foxtail has all of these awns sticking out. The yellow foxtail has much fatter seeds, and the giant one is fuzzier than the other two and also tends to droop a little bit. These have developed group 2 resistance and also in Pennsylvania. So I wouldn't be surprised if you were using group 2 and you were having troubles controlling this. Again, please let us know if you see that. There's also group 1 and group 5 resistance for these in the Midwest. If you purchase equipment and it comes in with seeds on it, you might wind up with an unexpected present of some new resistance in your field. But judging from the tables in the MidAtlantic guide, most herbicides are still working for this class of weeds. And that's the only annual that people were talking about a lot for the no-till. Do you guys have any questions for the no-till? So how is Johnson grass different from barnyard grass? Johnson grass is a lot bigger, and it's going to have those perennial root structures and the aggressive spreading rhizomes. Barnyard grass is an annual, so it's only going to grow in one clump, and it's going to be smaller. It's not going to have the ligule, which is the giveaway for barnyard grass. Any other questions? Okay. So let's move on into our tilled systems. This is the one that came up the most, which makes sense because this is another one of those top 10 globally destructive weeds, yellow nutsedge. Not a grass, but grass-like. We've already looked at the underground corms and tubers that it produces, often at the ends of its rhizomes. It has this really not grass-like flower and the triangular cross section. And this one is a really deep green, and a kind of a yellowy green. We don't usually say that color is diagnostic at all in grasses because they can vary so much based on stress and light exposure and all kinds of other things. But these are kind of a unique color. Its Achilles heels is pretty short. Those tubers are really abundant, but they're not particularly long-lived. And they're mostly in the top 6 inches of soil. So if you do dense planting, you can overtop the nutsedge, and that can help with management. And if you control it through rotation by shifting out of your summer field crops for just 2 or 3 years, you can get a good handle on your nutsedge population. And then this is the one, if you remember from the post table that I showed you earlier, this is the one that is just a responds to completely different herbicides. And for post application, really the group 2 was what worked for these, and these specific kinds of group 2. There's a question about how long does it take for grass seed to mature on the plant? It's different for every species, so I can't really give you a blanket answer for that. But I would not be surprised if you're mowing, a lot of grasses can go ahead and finish maturing even after you mow off the head. So they might not even have been mature when you cut them, but then once they landed, they used whatever energy was left in that cut piece to finish developing.
And Carrie, just to interject, we find that the group 15s are the best at controlling nutsedge, and dual is preferred over the Acetochlor and Outlook, and mainly because of its water solubility and it lasts longer.
Thank you very much. There are actually 2 species of large crabgrass, and this is the one kind of tricky annual. These are summer annuals, just like the Barnard Grass and the Foxtails and Witchgrass. But these are the ones that might fool you if you pull it up and look at the roots, because look at what's happening at the nodes on the stems. They're producing these extra roots. Crabgrass can flop, and then the tillers can reroot and keep going that way, even though they're an annual. So this is the one that might fool you when you're looking at the root systems. It doesn't actually have rhizomes though. It roots at the stem nodes. And it has these really bare and hairless stems, and then the obvious node with the super hairy leaf sheath above that, which is pretty unusual in the rooting. The leaf sheaths are hairy, the leaves are pretty hairy, and they're longish like those yellow foxtail hairs, but if you notice, they're not wispy. They stick straight out from the leaf and from the stem. This one has a rolled leaf structure. And these long, pretty unique looking flowering heads. If you're seeing this in your pasture, it might mean that you've got a little too much grazing going on in that pasture. This one's developed herbicide resistance in lots of different places in the US. It hasn't been recorded in New York yet. A lot of the pre-herbicides had good ratings for this species. Post treatments, glyphosate was the most effective, but you can also try some of the group 27s. Barnard grass. Someone was just asking about this. No ligul. This really unique, very heavy fruits on this big open spike. Really, we don't have another grass that has a flowering head that looks like this. The leaves are rolled in the bud. This also has a white midvein, just like the Johnson grass, but it doesn't have any rhizomes. So if you're not sure if you have one or the other, you can look at the ligules again, or you can look at the rhizomes. And there are several different management things here. Most of the herbicides work well on this, even though this had the most herbicide resistance of all of my grasses. This one was like 2 pages long. And this one has lots of places in the world where it's developed multiple resistances in the same population, including a 4-way resistance in Mississippi. And this, they do have group 5 resistance for this in Ontario, which is, you know, just across the lake from us. So this is another one to really, if you're having difficulties with control, we would expect to see this one developing resistance since it has done it so readily all over the world. Witchgrass is a summer annual that we see a lot, well managed by a lot of our herbicides. And it's pretty easy to identify because it is unbelievably hairy at all stages. Even the seedlings, I don't know if you can see, but the reason that the outline around this is so big is it has these giant hairs everywhere. As soon as it comes out of the ground, it's really hairy. And so it's easy to tell from the foxtail, even though the structure is pretty similar, because the foxtails aren't hairy when they come out of seedlings, and these guys are just coated in hairs. You can see them better in this one. This one is another one that has the white midvein. So you might look at that and think, is it Johnson grass? Is it Barnard grass? But this has the fringed hairy ligule. So you know it's not Barnard grass because it has a ligule and it's hairy, so it's not Johnson grass, and it doesn't have rhizomes, so it's not Johnson grass. These don't do dormancy really. Once, if they're in that top inch of the soil, they're going to germinate the first season. And it doesn't, it's not a super competitive weed. So this one is probably going to be managed by whatever your current routine is. If you see it, know what it is, and know that it's not one of our big problem weeds. Fall panicum. Also, this one, it has a membranous ligule, but it looks a little jaggedy and fringy at the top, but you can see the membrane down below. So this one could be a little tricky when you're looking at it. This one germinates really late. It doesn't germinate until the soil is warm. And so planting early, narrow crop spacing, and really helps create early canopy closure over this, gives your crop a head start. And this one doesn't do well once it's under the canopy. Very little herbicide resistance has been developed, or at least has been registered so far. This one is really a problem in our row crops. So rotating with either winter grains or with hay can help knock a population back for this species. So wrapping it up, when you go out to identify your grasses, here's some of the questions that you can ask to get to that, get down to just a few different species that you're trying to figure out what you're looking at. Look at the stem. If it's triangular, it's a sedge. And if it's in your farm field, that's probably yellow nutsedge. We have lots of sedges. I have some beautiful ones in my backyard, but they're not going to be weeds in your garden. In your farm field. If it's flattened, it's probably a folded leaf, and that will steer you into a fairly narrow set of species. If it's rolled, then you're looking at the bigger, then you move on to other questions, like, does it have a ligule? If it's not, then it's barnyard grass. If it does, Is it membranous? Is it hairy? And that'll help separate them out. Is there an auricle? How hairy are the leaves? What kind of hairs and where, whether they're on the top of the leaf or the bottom of the leaf or just around the collar. Some of the species you'll see when you look them up in Weeds of the Northeast, or you go to these many websites for identification, will say they're either no-haired or lightly haired. So just a few hairs doesn't necessarily mean a lot. But if it's super hairy, it's going to be something like witchgrass. What does the seed head look like? It's much easier to identify grasses if you go out at the time of year that they actually have flowering heads. So if you go out in the spring and you can't sort it out, then leave a few and come back in the summer so that you can do a better job at managing them the following year. And then short leaves are just regular. So with a wire stem muley has really short leaves. And so that'll help you ID that. I didn't get to some of the ones that you guys were asking about. And so Jen just put in the chat resources for Bermuda grass, which someone asked about. I haven't heard of that being a big problem in New York, but maybe it's one of the ones that's becoming a problem, or maybe it was from one of our international guests here in the webinar. So I put some ID stuff in there because that was one of the few that really did not respond to a lot of our normal grass control herbicides. So you'd really want to know if that's your problem. Reed canary grass, I put some stuff in for ID and where it is in New York, and Phragmites, which were two of the ones that I think were probably questions coming in out of the no-till section. So that is pretty much my talk. Why don't I answer any questions that folks have? And then we can walk through some of the links if folks would like to do them. Somebody has their hand raised. Ted has his hand raised. Ted, you can, I just allowed you to talk. If you want to ask a question, you'll have to unmute at your end. Or you can type your question into the chat. Sometimes people raise their hands by accident. So if he doesn't get to us in the next 10 seconds or so, we'll just move on.
There is a question in the QA box from James Gould. The question is pertaining to rye grasses. So I'm not sure whether this includes perennial and annual. What would be the best timing to mow? They start throwing seeds at B4 stage.
Jeff, do you have an answer for that?
Generally speaking, when we're trying to control annuals, if you mow or crimp just before the flower stage, that's usually effective in controlling that particular weed. Obviously would not work in the case of perennial ryegrass. And I'm not really sure what crops James was talking about as far as how to control these ryegrasses in row crops like corn or soybeans versus, maybe in a turf situation.
I can walk people through our website because I think that that's going to be a really good resource for them. Our website is here. So this is there's actually several weed ID sites here at Cornell. There's a really good one that has lots of management information that's actually targeted at turfgrass, but we link to it a lot in our chemical management section because they actually cover a lot of the same weeds. If you go here, we have sections for field crops and pasture. So if you go there, then you get all the different common problem weeds. And then if you go to the grasses, a grass page, it'll give you identification information. photos you can look at. Most of them blow up into much bigger ones if you tap on your phone or your computer. And then these tables that will help you answer those more detailed questions about how do I tell this apart from a really similar species. I just couldn't cover all of that today. And so I think this is a great place to go for that kind of detailed questions. And then one of the resources that I think people might not already know about because it's a Hort resource is this Eastern New York page. If you click on this, it downloads a worksheet that has a zillion weeds, many of which are also our weeds. Water hemp and yellow nutsedge and volunteer. I just saw volunteer rye is in here, clovers and chickweeds and velvet leaf. All of our weeds most of our weeds are in here. And then it goes through several of the common herbicides. They might be a little more veg focused than what you guys use. And then tells you what kind of control they have. So this might be a useful resource when you're trying to think about which mode of action is going to work well. And I'm pretty sure I put that in the links that Jen has, but if not, I'll just drop it into the chat. Another good resource here, if you go to grass-like plants, there's a how to identify grass-like plants page that has some really nice drawings. A lot of the ones that were in my presentation with explanations to help you remember what we talked about today. And then the weed species list has all the things that we have profiles for all lined up here with the grasses on the top, I'm happy to report. And then all the broadleaves below. We also have in here some harmful weeds, which might be useful. Over in the pasture area, we have a lot of information on toxic weeds that we pulled together last year. Yeah, so that's all I got.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. So we do have, going to see if we have a secondary poll. Doesn't look like we have the secondary poll, but if you want to post the upcoming meetings one more time, we can make sure that people know when these upcoming meetings will occur.
We'll do that. And then after that, do you want the QR code?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to share these in the.
I just posted it in the chat, the link to the future, as well as the past ones with the recordings.
Great.
All right, so you can look forward to next week. I'll be talking to you about weed management in corn from 12 to 1. And you can sign up on the Cornell site if you haven't already done so. The following week, Mike Hunter from Northern New York will be talking to you about weed management in soybeans. Following his talk the next week, Janice Degney will talk to you about weed management in hay and pasture. And the final discussion will be on the 16th of March. And Lynn Sosnowski will talk to you about alternative weed management. She has a lot of information about some of the newer things that are on the horizon right now as far as weed control, especially things like robotics and use of artificial intelligence and things, you know, really that you think of maybe for the future, but the future's here now. And some of these products, some of these machines are available and are in use, especially in vegetable cropping. So kind of interesting to wind up the series with Lynn Sosnowski. Right now you see an evaluation up. We'll ask you to take a couple minutes, answer those questions. And so these are the results. And in front of you, those people who are certified crop advisors, if you would initiate your app on your phone and use that app to scan this NCR code, that will give you credit for today's meeting. For those people that are certified pesticide applicators, please take this time now to go into the chat again, type in your full name and your certification number to earn credits for today's meeting. We hope you got a lot out of today's meeting. And if you have an interest in some of the meetings that are coming up, please make sure that you visit the Cornell site and get signed up and registered for those meetings. And just a reminder for folks that are planning on attending any of the other meetings who are looking to earn the New York State DEC certification credits, please enter about 15 minutes early just to make sure that you get a chance to type in your information before we start the meeting. We'll always start the meeting at 12 sharp. Thank you so much for attending today, and hope you will attend some of the future meetings.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
We're going to leave this open just for a couple more minutes to make sure that everybody has a chance to do their end of the meeting sign in.
Jeff, do the chats get saved in the recording or somewhere else?
Yes, they are saved.